Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, a chorus of souls separated from our bodies by the blade of Miyamoto Musashi. This week's episode is on The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. Musashi was a ronin in 17th century Japan, renowned for his sword fighting abilities, honed over the course of many victorious duels, intense training and meditation on mastery. Musashi went so deep with his understanding of sword fighting and strategy that he came to understand the very foundations of mastery. To prove the generalizability of his way, he became an accomplished sculptor, painter, and calligrapher. The Book of Five Rings was written in solitude, in a cave, in the last years of Musashi's life. This book contains general thoughts on his way of strategy, on how he achieved mastery, on the applications of his school, all woven together with what looks like Zen Buddhism. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon and have weekly chats with subscribers about our most recent episodes. I've also published a novel called Tower, a surreal, absurd journey involving the medical treatment of souls, a tower who remakes the world in its image, amphetamines, and a talking hat. You can find Tower on Amazon or on Apple Books, the links to which are in the show notes. So, if you're ready to hold no desire but to cut your enemy, then listen on. Enjoy. So I have an admission to make regarding my knowledge of world historical figures, and particularly those dedicated to strategic and sword fighting schools. That for a really long time, I thought that Musashi was only a protein powder brand, a manufacturer of sports supplements. I later came to learn that he was also a 17th century Japanese master swordsman. But for the longest time, I thought that Musashi was the group of people who made my protein powder. I really like them. And I now have even more strong positive associations with the name Musashi, having learnt that not only do they make very high quality whey protein and creatine, but he was also a really, really good swordsman. Took part in 60-something duels and won all of them. And when I say duels, this isn't like playing with Nerf guns or something. And a lot of these, I think, the loser died. Had his first duel when he was 13. Here we go. 61 duels, apparently. So this is the most duels won in Japan. The next most is 33. So this guy is absolutely blowing the competition away when it comes to defeating people in single combat with swords. This guy was an absolute machine.
Is that better than Floyd Mayweather? That's going to be up there. Like, what was Floyd Mayweather? Like 44 fights or something?
How many people has Floyd Mayweather killed as well? Because the stakes here are way higher. If you lose, you get your head chopped off. Whatever Musashi wanted to do to you.
Mayweather is 50-0-0 in professional bouts. But yeah, that's fighting with your hands, not fighting with swords. So Musashi, fighting with that's pretty
swords
good
as well. Yeah. So Musashi is already dual nogging Floyd Mayweather. Would have been a really scary guy.
Yeah.
In some ways, somewhat reminiscent of Ernst Junger, in that both of them were very, very good at killing people. Both found some deep philosophical meaning in combat and constructed philosophical systems based on their extensive experience of combat, and were both very, very artistically inclined. So Junger particularly with his novels. Musashi, to demonstrate, we will get into Musashi's view of mastery during the course of this episode, but to demonstrate that because he had mastered one way, his way of strategy, and from that he could abstract to a mastery of effectively any way he wanted, he learned how to be a sculptor and a painter, and there are still surviving paintings of his, and they're really beautiful. So it's not a perfect analogy, but in many ways, this is the 17th century Japanese Ernst Junger with all of the beauty and terror that entails.
Yeah, I think he would have, if you met him, he would have been probably just composed, don't you think? Not necessarily a psycho.
The composure makes him even scarier.
Yeah.
It makes him much scarier.
Cool, calculated. Like, Zen monk meditating before he chops you in half.
Yeah, well, not even meditating before he chops you in half, because there's a part in this book where he's saying your composure should be exactly the same at all times, whether you're drinking tea or you're on a battlefield with 20,000 other people all chopping each other to bits. You should be the same. So he's just completely unflappable. And so there's probably been a fair bit of mythologization around Musashi, but at least, so I'm no historian, particularly no historian of Japan in the 17th century, but apparently there are a bunch of historical sources confirming that a bunch of the things he claimed to have done, he did do. So if he isn't all that he is said to be now, then he was at least a lot of the way there. Which just it makes me take seriously the things he was saying and the things he claimed about himself. That yes, I am just the same in terms of my affect in the middle of a battle or at home, which is just so impressive and deeply unsettling that people like this have existed.
Imagine being this guy's like wife or something.
Oh, no.
Or son.
Talking about wife, I want a quote from the Wikipedia page, the most prestigious of all sources concerning anything, really. But this is a fantastic quote. Writings on Musashi's life rarely mention his relationship with women, and often when they do, Musashi is regularly depicted as rejecting sexual advances in favour of focusing on his swordsmanship.
Holy fuck.
What a king. Why would you do something like have sex with a woman when you could be practicing your sword technique? What a...
This guy's
Sword
just completely
Saint
obsessed.
Volcel Musashi.
Just all the time for decades and decades.
Just thinking about swords.
Yeah, that's terrifying.
What kind of absolute lunatic would challenge this guy to a duel as well? So when he was younger and not renowned, then maybe it was sort of understandable why someone would think that they could duel him. But when this guy was, say, 40 or 50, why on earth would you challenge him to a duel? I guess you'd think, oh, well, I could probably beat him. But evidently no one could.
Yeah, and at what point, like, how many duels does he have to win before you start being like, nah, not fighting that guy?
Just
is
not
it
worth
like
it.
10? Is it 20? Is it 30?
61.
Because he's probably the outlier, right? He's probably, I don't know, maybe like a couple of standard deviations above like your expected kill count.
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
I don't know what the stats were for kill counts in like 17th century Japan.
What's your kill death ratio in CS?
But I couldn't imagine it being like huge, right? Pretty dire consequences. I bet he was he was like many above the second best.
Yeah, well, we have numbers because it's not a perfect comparison because maybe the quality of sword fighters varied by age, but Musashi won 61 duels, and then the next most is someone who won 33.
Yeah,
and winning
go.
33 would be terrifying. Facing off against someone like that, facing off against someone who won 10. Think about MMA. If someone goes 10-0, that's a fighter that people would say is very, very threatening. You don't want to get into the ring with this person. Imagine someone who won 61.
Yeah, no way.
Just a steamroller. Impressions going into this book. What were yours?
I had heard about it before, and I think I might have even like flicked through it before. So good. I also know that like a lot of people who are into martial arts really like this book.
That would make sense.
Yeah. So like I occasionally like to train. So I think like this, and there's a couple other books that like come up in the martial arts stuff that are really interesting books. But this one in particular, I think, is like one of the big ones. So I think what I was interested in getting out of it though was like going in was I knew that like a lot of like high performing people apparently like think that this book is great. So like, okay, so maybe there's there's lessons in it that apply outside of sword fighting and stuff. Yeah. What were your impressions, Jack?
As I said earlier, for a really long time, I just thought Musashi was a manufacturer of sports supplements. But I eventually did. I'd heard about this guy. I'd heard of the Book of Five Rings and didn't really know anything more than that he was some famous warrior in Japan. So I really enjoyed learning about this guy. This guy was just ridiculous. Just an absolute monster, but tamed, but also unleashed by the Zen adjacent philosophy he applied to sword fighting.
Yeah, that's a very weird mix up.
Yeah.
It's just like took all the meditative parts. It's like have you heard, apparently as a part of training, I don't know if this is apocryphal, but if you're doing like, was it unmanned aerial vehicle training, UAV training for like, was it the US military? I was reading some article about it, and they said they started adopting mindfulness training. This was a long time ago. This is like several years ago.
Drone striking Pakistani weddings.
Yeah, for people in general, in like the combat forces, and in particular, yeah, like these drone guys, just like helping them keep cool whilst they, like blow people up and stuff. This is terrifying use of like Buddhist philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, I have more respect for people who apply this sort of philosophy when they themselves are in equal danger, or at least notionally equal danger to the person they're fighting against.
Yeah, because valid there for sure.
It's more valid. It's more impressive when Musashi, when he's fighting someone in single combat, will say, yeah, I am, in terms of my affect, exactly the same when I'm doing this as at any other time in my life. Someone who's basically trying to de-stress, or it's even darker, their corporate job or bureaucratic job is working out human techniques to make them feel less distressed about murdering people halfway around the world from death robots. That's much more dystopian.
Musashi, I would say there's this great book called Skin in the Game by Nassim Taleb about the need to, how do you, like, a form of accountability where not only do you gain if the decision that you're making pays off, but also you bear the negative consequences as well. And I mean, Nassim Taleb makes all these interesting points around like a lot of dysfunctional systems are where like decision makers and actors don't have skin in the game, so they don't really think that deeply about like the negative consequences of what they're going to do, and then you can like get all sorts of weird perverse incentives, and very interesting. But but like what like stuck out for me with this book is like a lot of it kind of related quite strongly to having skin in the game. Like,
yeah, that is true. Yeah.
He's saying like, yeah, I do these techniques and I've proven that they work through putting myself under threat of death. Like, if these are wrong, then I will die. This is like ultimate skin in the game.
Yeah, he
very much unlike the drone strikers.
Yeah, he put himself in a series of intentionally extremely dangerous situations. It's a more honest way to practice mindfulness, I guess.
I take him seriously.
I take it very seriously. Look, it's not the life for me. I'm probably over the hill. He was dueling people when he was 13. But I can respect that he did it. So I came into this with not many preconceptions, but feeling fairly positively inclined towards the book.
It's nice to read a book that actually seems enriching on this podcast. I don't know, some of the other books we read are like, they're still interesting, but damn, man, it's good to like have something like this every now and then.
Yeah, this was really good. So, a brief bit about Musashi also, I just don't know much about Japanese history, so the broader context within which this guy's life fitted, I just don't really know. So if people do know much more about it than I do, I apologize. So it's thought he probably lived between 1584 and 1685. Not much is known about his childhood. He was born in Harima province. He basically, the first bit of his life from 13 onwards was a succession of duels, and as he got more established, a succession of large battles where he led troops himself. 1633, he began staying with Hosokawa Tadatoshi. I'm sorry, I'm going to fuck all these names up. Who was daimyo of Kumamoto Castle. And there, as usual, he fought a bunch of duels there. He was made retainer of the lords of Kumamoto in 1640. He got money and his own retainers for this. 1643, he went into a cave as a hermit to write the Book of Five Rings and finished the book in 1645. So this guy, for a year and a half, 2 years, was living in a cave while it was thought he was also dying of lung cancer at the time. He went to a cave, wrote the Book of Five Rings. He wrote another book as well, which is called The Way of Walking Alone, or there are a number of different translations into English. The Way of Walking Alone is this series. It's basically a list of short aphorisms or short commands about how you should live your life, which would also be really interesting to cover for this podcast. And he, in 1645, sensing his coming death, gave away all his material possessions, gave the manuscripts of the Book of Five Rings and The Way of Walking Alone to the younger brother of his favourite disciple. It was either, so this was a bit unclear, it was either to the younger brother of his favourite disciple or to his favourite disciple. One of those two. I've read both ways. But he gave it to this guy, and then he died peacefully from lung cancer. This guy who lived his life not only constantly being in danger, but putting himself in danger, very consciously seeking out dangerous situations, died peacefully, having spent the last 1.5 to 2 years of his life in a cave in solitude, right? Thinking about the implications of what made him successful in his life, putting those to paper, giving away his material possessions, and then dying is a pretty cool way to go. That's an extremely cool way to die.
Legendary life.
Yeah. I think that's probably enough context on this guy's life. We'll probably end up talking more about some of his duels and battles, but I just can't emphasize enough how ridiculous this guy was. This deeply philosophical, calm, artistic master of combat who was undefeated. No one beat him. He just couldn't stop winning. He was relentless. It is funny too, so you mentioning that quite a number of high-performing individuals find a lot to like in the Book of Five Rings. I think the way that I first heard of it was in the context of some business leader saying that he had been strongly influenced by the Book of Five Rings in the same way that it's not really done anymore, but I think there was a wave during the 70s and 80s or something where American business people all said that they'd been influenced by The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And I think there's also a group of business leaders who attribute their success, or at least their advertised success, to the Book of Five Rings. And I do think there are high-level principles in this book that if you follow them, you'd probably be really successful. The thing is, a lot of those seem to be predicated upon being as ridiculously optimized as Musashi in the first place. Like, of course, this guy trained like crazy, but there was probably a lot of inborn talent at work as well. You could probably get pretty far by just training a lot, according to the way of strategy as delineated by Musashi in the Book of Five Rings. But this guy, even just his reaction times must have been those of a house cat, faster than a house cat.
Yeah, it's quite incredible.
Yeah.
I first heard about it through Joe Rogan, I think. I think Joe Rogan.
If there is an exemplar of the way of strategy, it is Joe Rogan. He's the same in the octagon. He's the same in the podcast studio. He's the same when he's bow hunting. He's just always living with a mind of the void.
So should we talk about like the overall structure of the core text? Yeah. So it's broken down into the original text is broken down into 5 books or 5 scrolls, one for each of the elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and heaven, or some translations a void, like void or emptiness. The translation I read translated as heaven.
It's probably worth adding too, because I read that apparently it's really, really hard to translate a lot of the stuff in this book into English because it's in Japanese. A lot of it is intentionally vague or seemingly contradictory. But when you translate into English, you have to make a decision as to how you're going to render that word or that particular phrase. So that's an additional layer of misunderstanding standing between us and what Musashi was trying to say.
Yeah.
So for our next Musashi episode, Levi and I will have learned Japanese fluently.
And we'll do passage readings of the book in Japanese.
In flawless Japanese.
I'm going to try to do it off memory. Correct me if I'm wrong. But earth was like an overview. Water was... I can't even remember water, but fire was... I immediately forget.
Wasn't
fire
water
was
like
war.
specific techniques?
Yes,
water,
yeah.
Like the particular techniques of sword fighting.
Yes, there was a compendium of different, essentially, moves, like in Tekken.
Yeah, like different button combinations in
Tekken. Scroll of Fire is like his view on war. Wind was his analysis of alternative schools and their flaws. And then Heaven or Void was essentially him talking about how to, talking about the application of this Buddhist concept, sometimes translated as emptiness.
And the cool thing about the structure, I might have totally misread it, but I had the feeling that the structure was almost in order of... So when you're trying to master something or practicing something, there's almost this stack of considerations from the ground level, most general, all the way up to specifics. And it seemed like this book was structured like that, or structured in that way, but in a circular sense. So the Book of Earth, or the ground book, is about the general principles of this guy's particular sword fighting school, or his way of strategy, and explaining why you should follow it. And then you go to the Book of Water, where he's saying, okay, these are the mechanics of the sword fighting. That it almost seems to be, so, in the Evolian sense, how there's the inner and outer spiritual war. The Water book seems to be the techniques of the outer spiritual war, the external violence, whose purpose is ultimately to wage the inner spiritual war, which is, in Evola's case, communion with the world of being. In the case of Musashi, given that a lot of his thoughts seems to be strongly influenced by Zen, or offshoot of Mahayana Buddhism, probably in some way union with the divine ground or with the void. So maybe that's what you're ultimately pushing for by using these techniques. But the Water book is this series of concrete physical techniques. The Fire book is then applying these at a broader scale. So Musashi saying, okay, well, if you can fight one person, if you get good enough at these techniques, you can arbitrarily scale the number of people that these techniques will be effective for. And so he's talking about these techniques applied both to single combat and to large-scale combat in the same section.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
And then you get to the Wind book. Apparently that's a pun, because the word for wind can also be the word for technique or strategies.
Or style, I think. Was the
Yeah,
other
style.
translation.
Yeah. And that's even higher up the stack. So you comparing your techniques to those of other people. And then the highest, but also in some ways the lowest, making it circular, is the Book of the Void or of Heaven, where he goes for pure, perhaps metaphysics or spirituality. It's the ground of everything that you're doing. And I do like the idea of someone practicing and training sword fighting or war enough that they can reach enlightenment through that. That is the technique of reaching deep spiritual insight.
Mastery leading to enlightenment. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. It is interesting how many people, we can talk about this later in more detail, how many people that we've covered for this podcast, but also in general, how many people have written very, very influential and profound works have at least in part reached their conclusions through violence or through the mastery of violence, or those who have taken part in conflict and used at least in part what they've learned in conflict in whatever philosophical or literary system that they're setting out.
Yeah, it's I could imagine like a lot of it's to do with like discipline and being able to like see things through. And
Discipline and intense accountability. In that
intense accountability,
there's a very clear fail state.
Yeah, yeah, good feedback.
I guess it feeds into discipline. There are very clear consequences for getting things wrong.
I also wonder if there's an element of, given that it's Mortal Kombat, and it might also be the case even in modern day setting where I suppose they're not literally killing each other, but they are. I'm sure it's as close as you can get, like stepping in the octagon without actually like going into real combat.
Enlisting.
Yeah. So there might be an element of like the fact that you're constantly thinking about your own mortality, that it might make you sort of like, how would you say it? Take the object of your attention really seriously and do the thing that's in front of you. And that comes through the martial art, but then being able to then apply that in the case of Musashi did with painting and art, but then you transfer that actually that's required for mastery of anything is that intensity of presence.
Intensity of presence plus there is always a structure at work that you can, to a greater or lesser extent, adhere to in trying to achieve mastery. But I imagine in combat, those strictures are made very apparent because if you diverge from the optimal path, then you're going to get your nose broken or you're going to get shot. And so that might also be part of it. The guardrails are very, very obvious.
Yeah. Very quick feedback. You really know when you've made a mistake.
I guess especially when you're dueling with swords, your ability to learn from the worst mistake, the most fatal mistake, is pretty limited if you just get your head cut in two. But maybe that's what wooden swords are for.
I suppose there's also an evolutionary aspect here, right? With like different approaches to sword fighting, because I mean, it's not evolutionary at the level of genetics, but it is evolutionary at the level of like the ideas that these guys had about how to train and how to approach their technique. Literally the ones who had bad theories about how to do this got killed off. And the survivor over decades of doing that was Musashi.
But it's not just the leaders of schools, but the schools themselves.
Yeah.
Because if you're a bright-eyed youngster and you really want to get into sword fighting, and you notice that all of the adherents of one particular school keep getting killed, you're much less likely to pick that one.
Yeah. There's
whereas if you look at Musashi and see that this guy just cannot get killed, he just keeps killing people in duels, you'd be pretty inclined to listen to him.
There's this concept, I think it's called preferential selection, which is like when people choosing between alternatives select the alternative that has the most like the largest crowd or whatever, already associated with it. So, for example, if you're going to a university club, like going to join a club at university, a lot of the times people will like tend to pick the biggest clubs part of that is that they're the biggest clubs, like that's why, so it's going to cause this preferential selection, and it's going to you're going to have this like sort of power law distribution of the size of university clubs. I wonder if that was also like happening as well with like, because you're killing off your students. If you're a bad teacher, you're going to kill off your students. New prospective students are going to see that all your students are dying, and the size difference in the schools, and you're going to, I'm going to try to get into Musashi school. I'm not even going to play this game.
Get into a school so you can personally be smacked in the head with a wooden sword in training by Musashi himself. Can you imagine even just training with this guy? How intimidating that would be. And I guess the point of his way is that you wouldn't be intimidated. You would just be completely even-tempered. But as I am not even-tempered in the way of strategy, I would be so frightened.
Yeah, I guess I would assume that all of his pupils would have started off terrified and then gradually learned. Yeah. I
guess it would be, well, if I fought Musashi, fighting anyone else can't be as bad, can it?
Yeah.
You've already started with the absolute worst opponent you could have. The guy who's definitely going to kill you.
He just beats you up like every day at school with a stick. And then until you stop fearing him, and then you can like go into battle with a real sword.
School of hard knocks, yeah. Wake up in the morning, get beaten with a wooden stick by the master for a few hours. Have lunch, go to sleep.
We used to, I occasionally played squash in high school. It's a very, very fun game and or sport. And, you know, we're all like, I don't know, 16, 17, 18, right? So at least we think we're fit. And like my school had like a lot of sports activities and stuff. And, but at squash, right, the teacher who took it, he's like, he must have been like 70 or something. He was like retired for the most part, and then came back to like finish off like our year 12 or whatever. But he also managed the squash team, and his technique was so insanely good that he just smashed all of us. Like it didn't matter how fit you were or how much you'd been practicing. He was just, his control of the court was insane. Like he'd have us like dashing from like one side of the court to the next, trying to just like keep up with like where he was placing the ball, and he'd just like stand in the center and he'd just like finesse it wherever he wanted. And he must have. I've had my ass handed to me by like an apparently unassuming old man who actually has an amazing skill at some physical activity. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Ones you have to be most careful of in the gym. The old men who look like they weigh about 50 kilos will come in and squat like 4 plates, ass to grass.
Yeah.
Absolutely humiliate you.
Yeah, compound interest, hey? Over like 4 or 5 decades. So Musashi must have been doing it, 56 years, right? Is that right? 69 minus 13, something like that. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, he just non-stop, constant sword fighting training. Right, you want to talk about... Actually, before we talk about the Book of Earth, I want to quote from the introduction of this book, because this sets the scene really, really well. So this is in his own words. He wrote the introduction. It's a kind of long quote, but it is very good. I quote, "I've been many years training in the way of strategy called Ni-ten Ichi Ryu, and now I think I will explain it in writing for the first time. It is now during the first 10 days of the 10th month of the 20th year of Kane, which is 1645 in brackets. I have climbed Mount Iwato of Higo in Kyushu to pay homage to heaven, pray to Kwannon, and kneel before Buddha. I am a warrior of Harima province, Shinmen Musashi no Kami Fujiwara no Genshin, aged 60 years. From my youth, my heart has been inclined toward the way of strategy. My first duel was when I was 13. I struck down a strategist of the Shinto school, one Arima Kihei. When I was 16, I struck down an able strategist, Tadashima Akiyama. When I was 21, I went up to the capital and met all manner of strategists, never once failing to win in many contests. After that, I went from province to province, dueling with strategists of various schools, and not once failed to win, even though I had as many as 60 encounters. This was between the ages of 13 and 28 or 29. When I reached 30, I looked back on my past. The previous victories were not due to my having mastered strategy. Perhaps it was natural ability, or the order of heaven, or that other schools' strategy was inferior. After that, I studied morning and evening, searching for the principle, and came to realize the way of strategy when I was 50. Since then, I have lived without following any particular way. Thus, with the virtue of strategy, I practice many arts and abilities, all things with no teacher. To write this book, I did not use the law of Buddha or the teachings of Confucius, neither old war chronicles nor books on martial tactics. I take up my brush to explain the true spirit of this Ichi school as it is mirrored in the way of heaven and Kwanon. The time is the night of the 10th day of the 10th month, at the hour of the tiger, 3 to 5 a.m. So, it is important to note that this guy had... Okay, so I was wrong. He'd had 60 duels or so before he turned 30. Then when he turned 30, he decided, no, I defeated 60 people without losing, but I'm not perfect. So I'm going to study for 20 years to work out the way of strategy. And then I will be ready. Then I will truly be a great sword master.
That's
This
quite
guy's
amazing.
just ridiculous. It wasn't good enough, those 60 duels. So he probably won more duels, because presumably once he was 50 and he'd finally, over the course of 2 decades, worked out the way of strategy, he would have been even better.
Yeah, that's just absolutely terrifying. Like, this guy's just like walking around. He's just studied just how to chop people in half. Just so long. Oh my god, yeah. Just
he'd
emerges
studied
from
how to
his
chop
cage.
people in half for so long and so effectively that through his mastery of chopping people in half, he also became a really good calligrapher and sculptor and painter. Just to prove how well his way worked. Well, his was the way of strategy, which became the way of no way. Because he didn't even limit himself to one school. He'd understood the ground truth of any sort of mastery, and from that could just do whatever he wanted.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Which is really cool. Yeah, this is a guy who makes even Ernst Junger look, if not like a normal person, then like he has some competition. Right, you want to get onto the ground book?
Yeah, sure.
So he starts off by saying that there are many different ways, capital W, way, and I quote, each man practices as he feels inclined. And he lists a few of these. He says the way of salvation by the law of Buddha, the way of learning, which is the way of Confucius, the way of healing as a doctor. And now he gets around to the way of the warrior, which is interesting. He says it's twofold, of pen and of sword. And he says that the way a warrior studies the way of strategy, which is, I guess, this twofold way of pen and sword, is by overcoming men. So it's unavoidable. You're going to have to kill a bunch of dudes if you want to study the way of strategy. I guess he said that he first dueled someone when he was 13, so he probably killed someone by the time he was 13. So I guess he can talk. He's really not laughing. This guy's dead serious.
There's an interesting point there about the need for the warrior, or I suppose he would call them the strategist, which I really like, to actually engage in real combat. Yeah, that's why the UFC has been so good for martial arts as a field globally, because you can do any combat sport essentially that you want, training that you want, save maybe Krav Maga or something like that, and you can try that in the Pentagon. And what you notice is that there's no Tai Chi practitioners in there.
Yeah.
Like, maybe there's people who do it beneficially just to like meditate and chill out and stuff, but not as an actual base to their martial arts. They all do Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, maybe a bit of judo. Like a few years ago, there's a number of people doing things like karate. I think there's less of that. a lot of them like also do a bit of TKD just to like improve their kicks. But the base has become very obvious. Like you need to have like good boxing, good kickboxing, and good ground game, and it's weeded out like all these other fake martial arts essentially. And there might be martial arts that have like a long, rich history or whatever, and that's really interesting. But if all you're ever doing is katas or whatever, and you're never actually like taking that kata into the real world, into an actual like fight, then is it really martial arts, or is it more like a kind of artistic form with your body?
Yeah, I guess MMA it's a commercialized evolutionary pressure or series of evolutionary pressures in the same way that all of the different sword schools in 17th century Japan were competing, and Musashi ended up just out-competing everyone else by being the best practitioner of it. Because I guess, yeah, like you said, you can do anything you want in the octagon, but chances are you're going to get your head kicked in by some guy with pink hair, face tattoos, and a really, really strong grounding in Muay Thai.
Yeah. Oh, man. It's like a Khabib. Khabib, just terrifying person. Just the cool calmness with which he dispatched of his opponents.
Yeah. He probably read the Book of Five Rings as well, given his even temper.
I actually think they did like a genetic analysis of Khabib, and they found, in fact, that it's encoded in his DNA.
Just choking people out.
No, the Book of Five Rings.
Choking people out gene. The Book of Five Rings is encoded in his base pairs.
Certain blessed preordained warriors are born with like an extra chromosome that just encodes the Book of Five Rings.
It just contains the Book of Five Rings. Yeah, he has additional bases. He has 26 bases rather than the usual 4. Just so you can actually spell out in English a translation of, and it has been English, by the way.
Yeah, of course.
A translation of the Book of Five Rings.
So, what is the way of strategy, Jack?
So basically, this whole book is about the way of strategy. And when he talks about the way of strategy, like you said earlier, it's kind of interchangeably used with the way of the warrior. And when he says the way of strategy, what he really means is his way.
Yeah,
because if every other school truly understood the way, then they would just be following his way, because he's reached the ground truth. So it's a total view of combat. It's not just sword fighting, because he says really early on, most schools that call themselves the way, or say that they're teaching the way of strategy, only teach sword fighting. And while that's important, it's not everything. And in fact, it's more of a way to achieve this inner mindset or this inner tranquility that is the true way of strategy. So sword fighting techniques are more spiritual techniques for achieving the way of strategy. The way of strategy overall, and this is taking in things from subsequent books, not just the Earth book, seems to be the way of no strategy. So he says you don't preference any one way or any one weapon or any one technique over any other. Instead, what you do is you have as your object, he says, cutting your opponent. So if you're a wayward youth in Broadmeadows and you've got a box cutter in your bum bag and you're just really, really looking to steal someone's shoes, your one object is just to cut your opponent, is to find someone at a train station at 2 a.m. and to cut your opponent. And in order to cut your opponent, what you want to do in Frangistan is you use whichever way and whichever rhythm at that precise moment will allow you to cut your opponent. And that is the way of strategy. It's this absolute flexibility. If you're using a box cutter, you use a box cutter. If you're using a kelp knife, you use a kelp knife. If you're using a carving knife you stole from your mum's kitchen, you do that. It's just no matter what, you're getting that pair of Nikes from the Frankston train station on a Thursday night.
Yes, Yeah, nice modern adaptation. Fantastic.
No, I'm speaking to the youth here.
Yes, continue.
And they need this to be relatable. Because all of our listeners, I'm sure, are Eshays who want nothing more than to rob someone at a train station in the early morning when they should be sleeping to go to school. So it's basically him saying you master every technique in every way, or at least you have such a deep knowledge of mastery that you can understand these things. Because he says, once you understand one thing, you can understand 1,000 things. He's saying there's just this foundational ground truth of strategy that once you really understand it, you're able to understand everything, and then in a wayless way in combat, such that you can cut your opponent as your singular goal. You're going to use anything. You're totally unpredictable. You're unstoppable. You're invincible. Your opponent can do nothing.
Yeah, there's this.
But the way you get to this point is through decades of intense single-minded training.
There's this idea in, I think, the Zen school of Buddhism particularly likes it, but I'm sure other schools have their opinions on it. Which is like, I think of it as spontaneity. So not only is like just like being present, being in the present moment a good thing, but acting spontaneously in the present moment. So not, I guess, like not like intercepting your own motor behavior with like discursive thought or anything like that, like thinking about what you're about to do. Like, you just do it.
Yeah.
And when it comes to mastery, I suppose, especially like with motor skills, like you definitely see this in elite athletes. They're operating in situations where like there's no time to think. Like, they've just got to go off these deep reflexes that they've grooved into their body. And then for situations where there's like, they haven't necessarily practiced the exact movement that they're going to need, they also have this flexibility to adapt their existing knowledge to that new circumstance. Yeah, I think it's really cool, that link. It's just so weird that he like used that Zen insight to then cut people.
Yeah,
it's kind of jarring for me.
I guess,
but I can see why he liked it.
Yeah. It did remind me also of Yukio Mishima in Sun and Steel, talking about, I think he called it living through the body, or he used various metaphors, but living through the body, in that he said, when a technique is truly mastered, it's when it is performed by the body without you really being aware of it, when it simply happens perfectly. And that only happens once you've practiced it to the point where it becomes part of the body and completely natural. And he was using it to talk about, one, de-individuating his artistic expression to make it more broadly applicable when he was trying to change his writing style to not be of night thoughts, but to be of his body. But also when he became much more nationalistic and started pursuing things like kendo and bodybuilding to encourage Japanese people to pursue, I guess, imperial Japanese nationalism. I found it interesting that there are also similarities to that, to making something of the body. It's probably because what Musashi here is describing is one of those invariant features of human experience that through human history we've had a few geniuses who are able to actually describe these invariant features of human experience, where with a skill or with a set of skills that orient themselves towards some sort of desired behavior or some sort of goal, you need to practice them to the point where you're not thinking, where there's nothing slowing you down or no doubt or consideration that gets in the way of them performing themselves through you. It's almost where you become a vector for those things that you have perfected to act through. that true mastery comes.
Yeah. That's so interesting. It's like probably in the moment of performance. I could see that applying to like dance and martial arts, and especially physical activities. Although I think it probably also applies to like creative and like intellectual activities.
Yeah, I wouldn't separate the two. I think it acts in the same way through all of them.
Yeah. You don't want to
once you go deep enough.
Yeah, you want to get out of your own way. Like you're practicing the craft or the skill, and then when it comes time to perform, you're actually just like dropping your hang-ups and just letting it rip.
Yeah. In part it could be, and this would make sense through the lens of him being influenced by Zen Buddhism, but overcoming of the self or sidelining the self being very important, because those considerations or the ability to consciously consider is a function of the self, of that which calls itself Levi or Jack.
Yes.
And that it's slow, it's oftentimes indecisive, and especially in something like sword fighting, where if you're slow and indecisive, you just die. It's probably a huge liability. So what he's probably talking about, and what I imagine other people like Mishima were getting at, is that you need to transcend the self, and Mishima called it the body, or living through the body, that which acts once the self has been silenced, and which is the path towards true mastery. Allowing that to act might be what the way of strategy ultimately is. Allowing it to act with respect to sword fighting, but also just violence in general. Because he says that once you understand the way of strategy, you can also lead troops as a general and crush your enemies en masse. It's actually a very good skill set.
Yeah, for sure.
Highly generalizable skill set.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's like this like flow or whatever, you know. Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating that he went that deep with it. I can kind of see why he thinks like obviously not enlightened. I don't know what that means experientially, but at least going off the stuff that I've read, if it is some meaningful and real phenomena, then I can kind of see why like mastery of a physical activity, or maybe mastery of anything, could be helpful on that path potentially.
Yeah, I should also preface this that I have also not achieved enlightenment, but I feel like it being a physical activity is... I achieved enlightenment, and my goal was to have this podcast going. This is the way of podcasting, capital W way of podcasting, which we will be selling to you if you sign up for our newsletter, where we will tell you all of the insights that we have gained, having gained mastery, insight, and true enlightenment. Missives from the void of podcasting. What was I saying? The physicality of it, I think, is probably important, because at least in enlightened master Yukio Mishima's telling, you need the body, or the body really, really helps in quietening the self, because it's this thing that can act without the self. And if the body acts perfectly enough, then part of you realizes that that the self is not necessarily the one acting, and action can be taken without the self. I think training of the body is really, really important in that. Yeah. I'm not sure, for people who are listening who've done really grueling physical activities, like say doing a marathon or a really long ruck, or even if you've hit, I think it's different with endurance activities, but even if you've hit, say, a squat which is at the absolute limit of your ability, and you push through it, there is this sense of purification, of quietness. Say when you're 40 Ks deep in a marathon, there is this real mental stillness, because there is just your body trying to push through.
Yeah.
Probably endurance rather than strength sports are better for hitting that point.
Yeah, for sure. I love that you use the word purification. Jack's just purifying himself for going on ridiculously long runs.
I think there really is something to it. I think the physicality is really important.
Yeah, the quietness when your mind goes quiet. And
just burn out the sense of self by running for a really long time.
Yeah, you just run for a really long time. You can also get it free diving.
Yeah. depriving the self of oxygen.
The first couple of dives, your mind's all oh crap, what am I doing? And then at some point it's just no, just go down, come back up. And it's just in the water and not thinking about being in the water.
And with that, how much do you think is also of that with freediving is from practice, in that you've practiced it a number of times, and instead of consciously thinking about, I don't know anything about freediving, but going through the checklist of things that you need to be doing consciously, instead you jump in the water and you let instinct take over or training take over?
Yeah, well, I'm not particularly good at it. So it's just my brief exposure to it. Although I do really I need to get back in the water actually. But I need a suitable wetsuit for the Tasmanian winter.
Tasmania's nice and warm. Yeah, the notoriously warm Tasmanian waters.
Yeah. So anyways, yeah, sort of. I think maybe the elite freedivers or people who do it a lot have zero or very short time to quietness of the mind when they go out because of all that practice and rehearsal. And also a lot of freedivers actually do meditation and breathing exercises and stuff before they go out anyways. It's really important to be calm and just loose, not you don't want to be all all tense and stuff. It's really bad. So yeah, maybe the really elite ones, that's more of a thing. I'm still struggling. When I go out, I still struggle with it.
Yeah.
Get there eventually.
Yeah,
that's I guess that's being on the path, right? So yeah,
yeah,
you're going to struggle with stuff.
Like with any physical pursuit, I'm not skilled enough at any one physical activity to be in the state where I'm always selfless. So even in distance running, there'll be plenty of moments where I become self-conscious again and think, oh, this really hurts. I want to stop. But there are also moments where you just lose that.
Yeah, what's worse is fartlek. Fartlek sucks.
Oh, those are so good though, because especially when you do the spontaneous ones.
Yeah,
it's really good.
And by suck, I mean at the end of the workout, you feel great for having done it.
Yeah,
but it's at least the ones that I've done 25 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever. You're just running. It's far enough with the speed play to hurt, and it's get your breath up, get out of breath and all that sort of stuff. But it's not long enough, with a long slow pace run to get into the zone or whatever. It's I always find it's sort of for 40 or 45 minutes that I need to be doing it before things just start flowing a bit more. But that's me, at least. It might be different for you.
Yeah. Perhaps what Musashi is getting at, and what a number of the other people we've mentioned who use these sort of techniques of mastery are getting at, is that the sense of self could in some ways be thought of as commentary, in that so much of what your idea of the entity which calls itself whatever your name is really this mechanism of describing what is happening. I do wonder often in some ways if it is an outgrowth of our ability to empathize with others, because humans are social animals living in groups. It's really, really useful to be able to model what's going on in other people's heads. And we developed this concept or this ability for empathy in that way, to work out what other people around us are thinking and be able to predict their actions based on that. And our sense of self is our mind empathizing with itself, and in doing so forming this concept of what it is doing and making a persona of what it is doing as it tries to model itself or work out what it is doing. And so this sense of self that tells you when you're on a really long run, for example, that your legs are really tired, your lungs are burning, you want to stop. That's your mind making a model of the persona of that which is running. And so maybe Musashi overcomes that that sense of self or that modeling by repeated practice, so that constant commentary, which isn't really serving much of a purpose in the moment of sword fighting, for example, he can overcome that and achieve this sort of impersonal mastery in that way. Maybe that's what he's getting at when he's talking about the void and ultimately the way of no way, which is the foundation of the way of strategy. I could also be totally misunderstanding it.
Yeah, potentially. I feel like this would be worth reading again.
Yeah, definitely.
So
this is a really good book.
Should we move on to the Book of Water, or was there anything in the Book of Earth that you still wanted to touch on?
Just some brief things, more because they're famous. Because I think we've touched on what these things at least mean to us. There's a famous section where he compares the way of strategy to carpentry and building a house, and he says, say, the carpenter and a commander, in the context of the way of strategy, both know natural rules, and he says this is the way of the foreman. And he talks about how a foreman who is really skilled in the way of the foreman knows architecture, knows organization, knows how to order around people who know, for example, the way of carpentry, to do things, how there's this natural order that exists independently of you. And to achieve the capital W way of, say, being a foreman or building a house, you need to de-individuate to the point where you just become coincident with this pre-existing way of building a house, and then you build houses really well. I thought that was really cool.
You're becoming
and
like
then,
the...
From that, he's like, oh, well, it's the same thing with learning to chop dudes in half.
Yeah. It sounds almost like Spenglerian. The way for the craft is like
so much better than Spengler.
the soul of the craft you inhabit through mastery. You embody, or the soul of the craft becomes instantiated in you.
Yeah, this is much more terse than anything Spengler wrote, though. Spengler was pretty prone to logorrhea, whereas I really like with this book how it's very terse, and then at so many points he just goes, look, I actually can't teach you this in writing. You're going to have to learn it otherwise. Or he ends so many statements with, you must study this carefully. Where he'll say something and then go, yeah, over to you, mate. You've got to study this carefully. It's up to you.
Which is fair enough. It's probably one of those things where it's like the deep knowledge of it can't be necessarily like encoded using language to another person. Like the other person has to create it through practicing it themselves and experiencing it themselves.
Yeah. Hence look, I'm not sure which Japanese word is translated as way, but at least if the English translation is accurate, that would make sense in that it is a way. It's not some sort of destination that you arrive at having read in the Book of Five Rings about how to achieve mastery. It's this constant path. Yeah, but how about should we get on to the water book? Or
yeah, why don't you say, I'll be back in 1 minute and I'll let you.
Oh, sure. So actually, he talks about how it's really, really good to train with two swords, a long sword in each hand, and apparently fighting with two swords is part of Musashi's school of sword fighting. Because he gives a bunch of technical reasons as to why when you're holding one sword with two hands, it's hard to defend or to attack from certain positions. So his solution is that you just have a sword in both hands and you get so good at using a sword that you use the sword in both hands equally well. And then you have no weaknesses. You're absolutely unstoppable. You're twice as good as someone who's only got one sword. I really like this quote. So I quote, "According to this Ichi school, you can win with a long weapon, and yet you can also win with a short weapon. In short, the way of the Ichi school is the spirit of winning, whatever that weapon and whatever its size." I just thought that's basically the Donald Trump school of just winning all the time. If we learned anything from what's it called? The art of the deal. Is it Trump's strategy? Trump's way is just winning. So I can't help but think that Donald Trump is actually the foremost modern adherent of Miyamoto Musashi's Ichi school of strategy. He's just winning. That's at least if you go by what Trump says about himself, all he does is win. He also has this part of about timing. Timing will become important because so many things in this book are explained in terms of timing and in terms of onomatopoeic cues for timing, which I'm just not sure how you meant to read in English. But he says that basically all sword fighting, and then generalizing from that, just all of everything, is a matter of correct timing. So using the specific example of sword fighting, you need to work out what your enemy's rhythm is. And then once you've grokked their rhythm, then you apply a counter rhythm. And then you put in unexpected rhythms and you defeat them. This also means that for your own technique, you should have an unpredictable rhythm, which really is of a piece with him saying that you shouldn't favor one weapon over others, or favor one overly much, or favor one technique over others overly much, because that makes you predictable. Your rhythm is predictable, which means that you can be easily overcome by one who is perceptive enough to see what you give undue attention to and what you use too much. I'm sure we'll talk about rhythm a fair bit later on because it just keeps coming up. He gives 10 important lessons, which are basically dot points, which are necessary for learning Musashi's strategy. And these must be set in your heart when you go to learn the way of strategy. And I suppose as you learn the way of strategy, these things set in your heart they'll go from things you read in a book or things you've memorized to things you truly feel and intuitively understand. So they are: do not think dishonestly. The way is in training. Become acquainted with every art. Know the ways of all professions. Distinguish between gain and loss in worldly matters. Develop intuitive judgment and understanding for everything. Perceive those things which cannot be seen. Pay attention even to trifles. Do nothing which is of no use. And he says that learning these things and strategy will allow you to beat people in fights, which leads to peace and stability, which is good. Let's go to the water book. So the water book was interesting. Probably, I found it less interesting than the Earth book, but that's because I know nothing about sword fighting. And a bunch of things in the water book are him describing the exact techniques used to just to kill people. He's got this one where it's basically the technique of just keep deflecting your enemy's attacks until you learn their rhythm and then kill them in one blow. Just slice them to pieces in one stroke. This guy would have been so frightening.
Yeah, this part of the book wasn't as interesting. Like all the other parts of the book kind of have, these like mic drop moments. He's like, here's some wisdom, like take that. This pithy little like sentence that sounds really wise, at least. And I really like that. But this part of the book was very like lacking in that. I suppose if you use your imagination, you could maybe think of some of these things as metaphors, but I'm pretty sure some of them are just like, it's just a bunch of techniques for just chopping people.
Oh yeah. There's this whole bit about how this is the stance you should take. That's really, really good. If you're into sword fighting, I'm sure this is really helpful.
Yeah.
It's a guy who knew a lot about sword fighting, telling you how he does stuff. I think a lot of these techniques, as I was saying earlier, drawing a comparison between this and Evelyn's inner and outer spiritual war. A lot of these are techniques for the outer spiritual war because he'll say things like, okay, so with the example of your stance and posture during a sword fight, he says actually, this should just be the same always. You should never not be doing this. You should live in such a way that your footwork and how you walk is exactly the same going down the street as it is when you're fighting someone in single combat, as it is when you're on a battlefield surrounded by people who are killing each other. It's just always the same. There is one way, and you will come to realize the unity of all ways by studying sword fighting for decades of your life. This guy was pretty optimized.
The bit at the end of the chapter, the attitude, no attitude technique.
Yeah.
I thought that as this kind of like emptiness theme weaved in throughout. He's talking about like at some point transcending needing to think about like taking on stances or whatever, and the only thing that you're like I think in Zen sometimes it's referred to as single pointed focus. Like single pointed focus on your objective to just cut the enemy, and there's no there's no what would you call it, like there's no ping or anything. It's just
you're working with a very low latency connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's interesting, so bringing up the attitude, no attitude thing, I guess this is pretty illustrative of how he approaches a lot of problems or apparent contradictions in this book and resolves them. So he says that you've got schools of sword fighting which focus on attitudes. I think there are 5 attitudes. It's head, torso, your arms, legs, like left arm, right arm, and legs. And he says that certain schools will teach you to approach each of these things in different situations and with different techniques. But then there are other no attitude schools of sword fighting which don't teach in that way. And then what Musashi says is what you should actually do is train the way of strategy to the point where you might use bits of either of these schools, of either the attitude schools or the no attitude schools, but you're just going to pick them intuitively based on your single desire to cut your enemy. And hence you arrive at the attitude, no attitude style.
That's so good.
If you look at this very abstractly, it's kind of he's saying, train so much that you just do what works. Just do what gets the job done.
Yeah.
But while you do it, you need to maintain perfect calm within your soul.
Yeah, you want to be like, imagine it's this sort of a spontaneousness, flexibility, and then sort of low latency retrieval of motor patterns.
Yeah.
And it just bypasses like your neocortex. It just goes like straight out from your spine or from like your motor cortex. It's like instantaneous.
Also, did you notice there are a bunch of moments in this book where he'll just say something and it almost, at least for me, it sent a chill up my spine of thinking that, again, this guy actually existed and was probably like this. Because one such moment was in this water book where he's talking about your gaze and how you should look at the world. And he says, you've got to train yourself, and this takes a long time to train, but train yourself to barely move your eyes and just take in everything in your field of vision equally. This guy's just cruising around. He's got perfect peripheral vision. He can see you coming from 180 degrees in front of him, and he's going to chop your head off without even looking at you or needing to point his eyes at you because he can see you already just out of the corner of his eye, and he can fight there with one sword.
No, he's actually his peripheral vision has transcended 180 degrees or whatever the cone is for humans.
Yeah, he's got 360 degrees of vision.
Yeah, not only 360, but like top down. You know, like those cars where they have like a little image of themselves from the top and like project themselves onto the road.
This guy's just pushed his FOV slider way up to the top in the system settings. Well, it's impossible to get the jump on him.
It's like first person shooters or whatever, where you can like be in first person or like switch into like behind the head view.
Oh, yeah, he transcended first person. This guy was playing life in third person mode. He's just using hacks. That's his secret. He transcended the first person perspective.
He's just always having an out of body experience. He's so single-mindedly focused on cutting everyone around him.
Yeah. That's his one focus. He put it down in writing. His one focus is on cutting his opponent.
He's always...
Every action in his life, because he said you don't do anything which doesn't have a goal, and his goal is cutting his opponent. So every single action in his life is oriented towards cutting someone.
It's just like, just wouldn't want to be around him ever.
No, I guess so long as he didn't consider you an opponent, it would be okay. So you just have to go out of your way not to give him the impression that you were an opponent.
Yeah. Presumably, he constrained the actual cutting of people to proper duels.
I don't think this guy engaged in random acts of violence. I think he only engaged in highly considered acts of violence.
Consensual, which I would assume, consensual and reciprocal cutting.
Yeah, which makes it okay, which makes it kind of cool, actually.
But the idea that, like, you could sit down, like, hey, Miyamoto, hey, man, you want to come get a coffee or whatever? And it comes up to the cafe or whatever. I suppose maybe you'd be saying something like, hey, you want to come to the onsen on Sunday and, like, hang out with the boys in the onsen? And he'd be like, yeah, okay. And as he's, like, dipping into the onsen is like Japanese sauna. Okay. Sorry, I should have said that. And part of it is, it depends on the setup, but, like, part of it is you like go into the water. You go in the sauna and then you jump in the water. And it's really nice. And he'd just be like, as he's going into the water, you just know that he's just thinking, how can this help him get better at cutting people? Like, he can't just chill out. He's like, how can I even just, like, sit here and relax? But also, how could I cut these guys?
But it's not only that, because he would only have agreed to come with you if that would in some way get him closer to his goal of cutting his opponent. So you know he's only there because in some way him being there with the boys in the sauna is getting him closer to cutting his opponent. And you also know that his inner state in that sauna is exactly the same as on a battlefield. There's just no difference.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah. This guy's crazy. Cool, but crazy.
This guy is extremely cool. Yeah, so the fire book. The fire book is more of him talking about various techniques, but it's a bit more high level. But he'll still list a bunch of different fighting techniques in this. And it's interesting here because he's talking about, again, the unity of the way of no way, where he says, these techniques can be applied to defeat an opponent in single combat, and if you understand this way enough, then you'll also you can fight 10 people at once with exactly the same level of success, or even more than that. You just keep fighting more and more people, and if you understand this way deeply enough, then it is the same. It's always the same. So, for example, when I was saying earlier about how he, in the Book of Water, he was telling you about how you should look in general at the world with paying attention to all parts of your visual field. And he says when you're doing this too, you have to pay attention equally to really tiny things and to really big things. And then he says, okay, well, when you're fighting one person one-on-one, your gaze should be the same as when you're beholding a battlefield. And in both cases, if you really understand how to look equally at trifles and gigantic things, then you're looking in the same way at everything in every situation because you truly understand the way. And this guy was just optimizing his visual system. He's
there's this
optimizing everything.
There's this idea in meditation, I guess. What's the book that I'm referring to? I can't remember what the book's title is, but it's a very good book. Maybe I'll try to recommend it sometime. That talks in depth about the experience of like going deeper into concentration based meditation, and it's really interesting. So, like I was saying before, this idea of like single pointed focus might be one way of putting it. There's this other idea of, I think I kind of think of it as like diffuse attention. So you have like focus and then diffuse attention. And like your point of focus is within this broader field of diffuse attention. And it's like the visual analogy would be like using a torch that's very focused versus using a torch that's like got a very like broad angle to it. And the idea is you should be able to kind of like have both. Like in really deep meditation, you can simultaneously like train your attention on like a single thing, and also you're aware of like all the other things that are happening in your like sensations or whatever in your body. And again, it sounds like just like given that he's into Zen and whatever, it sounds like he's kind of talking about this ability to like hold both perspectives simultaneously. Okay, so like I'm executing this particular action or responding to, you know, my opponent's thrust or whatever, and simultaneously I'm observing like the things like the context of what's happening. That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. And again, if it were just anyone writing about this, I'd think that they were probably just trying to talk themselves up. But given who did write this, I'm inclined to think he's probably actually being serious. He's probably genuinely telling you how he inhabits the world and what his internal state is as he wanders around 17th century Japan and sword fights people.
Yeah, we don't know how different each of our subjective experiences could be. And his might have been quite radically different. The way that he trained himself.
I'm pretty confident in saying that his internal experience was likely dramatically different from my own. Extremely different. It's also...
Sorry.
So I'm not going to go into much detail about the different techniques that he lists here, because I just don't have martial experience. I don't really know how to analyze these things, but I do come away from reading them with the impression, again, this is a really scary guy, because he'll say things like, he's got this technique called to hold down a pillow, which he says is really, really important, both in single combat, but also in large-scale battles. And basically, this is not allowing the enemy's head to rise. So you suppress the enemy's useful actions and allow mistakes. And he combines this with other things, like he'll talk about with footwork and positioning, how he seeks to both have an unpredictable rhythm so the enemy is never able to work out what he's about to do, and to constantly attack and drive his enemy into really, really disadvantageous positions, like driving him into a corner or making him trip over a rock or a hole that you see and you like herd them into that, or to step into a bog. This guy would have been so scary, just unpredictably attacking you and chasing you around the battlefield until you fall over or get stuck in mud, and then he kills you.
Yeah, he's like playing chess on the battlefield, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really with the terrain and the bodies. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So there are all sorts of different techniques, which all have quite nice poetic names, like to become the enemy, to release four hands, to move a shade. Some of these are just, yeah, you're right. He's playing chess, because with some of these he'll say, oh, you should feign weakness or be predictable, look like you're weak so that the enemy reveals their weak point, and then you immediately exploit it and kill them.
I'm pretty sure there was in fact a move in Pokemon for some of the Pokemon called feign. Was that a move? Like,
probably.
Yeah. It's like, oh no.
My knowledge of Pokemon stopped with gold version. So, yeah, there might be.
That was the peak Pokemon, though. That was amazing.
Oh, that was catching Ho-Oh in that big tower. Yeah, wow. Yeah. That was
mastery.
Granted too, I was really young and hadn't really been exposed to games before at all, so everything was so new and so exciting.
That was actually, in fact, the moment at which Jack achieved enlightenment, was when he caught Ho-Oh.
Yeah, I was playing Pokemon Gold version on my Game Boy Color.
Should we move on to the Wind book?
Yeah. So the Wind book, like this was probably the bit of the book I found the least interesting, because it's mostly him talking about why other schools aren't very good and why his school is so much better. Granted, it's still... So when I say it's less interesting, it's still pretty interesting, because this whole book is interesting. It's just when compared to the four other books, there's less that I find engaging. because a lot of the criticisms he'll have of other schools almost always boil down to them being too limited and them putting too much emphasis upon a handful of techniques, which makes them predictable. And if you know the way of no way and how to pick an enemy's rhythm, then you'll immediately pick up on what they overuse, what they're weak to, and you'll be able to defeat them. I've got a few quotes here which do sum up a lot of this guy's philosophy and how he approaches things, and again, just make him sound really scary. So I quote, "Whenever you cross swords with an enemy, you must think not of cutting him either strongly or weakly. Just think of cutting and killing him. Be intent solely upon killing the enemy. Do not try to cut strongly, and, of course, do not think of cutting weakly. You should only be concerned with killing the enemy." So this is in the context of some schools which say, oh, you should only cut strongly or you should cut weakly. And Musashi, like we've talked about earlier, is basically saying, master cutting weakly and cutting strongly to the point where you're not even thinking about them. Instead, all you've got is your focus of just killing a dude, and you just use whatever you've got in your arsenal to kill him without even thinking about it.
Yeah, there's almost a... it's like a rejection of specialization. It's these...
Or you become so specialized in everything that you're not specialized anymore.
I suppose specialized in cutting people. It's like, I know all the different ways to cut people.
But then he went from that specialization to being able to paint really beautiful pictures. Because he said, well, I've mastered a way, so now I understand the ground truth of mastery, and I just apply it to whatever I want. Which he did. Apparently he made really beautiful sculptures as well to prove to people the unity of the way. But here's another good quote, which might give you some sense of what it's like to be attacked by this guy. The sure way to win thus is to chase the enemy around in confusing manner, causing him to jump aside, with your body held strongly and straight. The same principle applies to large-scale strategy. The essence of strategy is to fall upon the enemy in large numbers and bring about his speedy downfall. By their study of strategy, people of the world get used to countering, evading, and retreating as the normal thing. They become set in this habit, so can easily be paraded around by the enemy. The way of strategy is straight and true. You must chase the enemy around and make him obey your spirit. Actually, a general rule in a lot of this book is that Musashi really likes attacking. He doesn't like passivity and waiting for the enemy, because he says then you're being controlled by your enemy. So he advocates for just going at someone, just going all out at them all the time in a confusing, unpredictable way, putting continuous pressure on them, never letting them get their footing, never letting them attack properly. He was just relentless. Just absolutely relentless.
Well, you don't win championships on defense. Like you've got to go and score, right? So obviously you don't want to get cut yourself. So there's a necessary component of defense. But you got to cut the other guy first, man. You got to go get him.
Yeah. He's got that go-getter alpha attitude. So you want to talk about the Book of the Void now?
Yeah.
I found this one really interesting because the other books, to a lesser extent, the Book of Earth, but that too, had a more concrete focus on strategy and sword fighting. And yeah, he'd use metaphors of other ways, like, for example, the way of carpentry when he's talking about building a house. But it was always quite concrete, whereas this is not concrete. This is cutting to the underlying nature of everything that he's pursuing. And I really enjoyed that structure. How he starts off general and gets more concrete as the book goes on. So starting with the Book of the Earth and then getting to the Book of Wind, where he's critiquing specific techniques of different schools and comparing them to his own. And then at the end, it gets super abstract again. Or, if not abstract, then super abstracted. Very general and generalized. I really like that structure. And it's probably reflective of his own thinking on the subject.
Yeah, there's a really interesting, I think this is the guy's name, that I can't remember the philosopher's name, But there was this one time, maybe we should try to read it for the show. It was a really weird book.
Sure.
It was it was a book maybe out of the Theravada tradition that was just about emptiness, the Buddhist concept of emptiness. And this guy who wrote the book, he's like one of the big philosophers in Buddhism, like a few hundred years after the Buddha. Oh, actually, it was probably a long time after the Buddha. And I was just like, I don't get this. What is this guy talking about? This is like, it's so esoteric. I'm like, I want to know what you're talking about because it sounds interesting. And I'm trying to read your book, but it's like terse. It's almost like, you know, like a lot of continental philosophy can be very like dry and hard to get through. It's like that, except the guy's talking about the Buddhist concept of emptiness. And I was just like,
yeah, and it's not verbal diarrhea because if there's one thing continental philosophers can't do is edit down their word count. Like, it's physically impossible for a continental philosopher to write any book that's under 1,000 pages. That's only a slight exaggeration. It's just not terse at all.
Yeah, I'll find the book and see, like, maybe we can read it sometime. But anyways, like, the void stuff is really weird. Like, I still don't understand it. I feel like...
No, I don't. I also haven't achieved enlightenment, so... Of course I don't understand the void.
I feel like there's...
But they would also say, if you understand the void, then it's not the void.
Yeah. I feel like there's been moments when I have been really into... Because I know, like a lot of people, I'm sure. Most people don't meditate, like, regularly. I sort of go in waves, like, sometimes when I really, like, am stressed out and stuff, I'll try and meditate more. But when I get really into it, and you're like in a very long meditation like session, I feel like I've had these like glimpses of like there being no sense of how would I describe it? There's no sense of otherness between, like, under normal circumstances. I feel like there's the world out there, and then there's Levi sitting back in here. And there's this kind of unitary thing that happens. It's like monadic or something, where like you stop having a sense of distinction between the world out there and like experience through your like sense perceptions and like this other thing being Levi. It's just the sense of being Levi goes away, and all there is just this kind of like experience, this like flow of experience and sensations. And yeah, it's I think there's that's the kind of stuff that they're sort of talking about. I'm not entirely sure though. That's my guess, at least.
That sounds like with distance running, like, probably the main reason why I do distance running is it depends. So things under probably
100 kilometers.
25Ks.
Yeah.
things under 25Ks, you don't really get this state. So and you don't hit the wall or anything. So those are more enjoyable. So getting outside and seeing stuff. But particularly anything over, I think, 35. So 25 to 35 is kind of a mid zone. But over 35, oftentimes I'll get into this state of, at least intermittently, there's not a commentary track. There's not a sense of self. There is just, it's not you're moving through the environment. There is just movement through the environment and the sensation of movement. And those moments are really transcendent and really, really special. And I don't get it anywhere other than longer distance running. Granted, I don't do distance swimming. I don't do long distance cycling. So it's probably the case for other endurance events as well. That's part of the reason why, like, I've technically done an ultra of a 44K race, but it's not a real ultra. I would like to do proper ultras, like a 50K or plus, at least once, to see if that feeling, if there's another level to that feeling, if you can just keep pushing deeper as you go further and further, or if that concept of depth even makes sense, or if even that concept of depth falls away if you've done enough Ks.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It is funny, like, yeah, like as you said, like before, transcendence. It's at the end of the day, you're doing something that your body just does. You know, just you're running, right? But
Mm,
obviously, you've got to train to like get to those sorts of distances. But um, how do I put this? That transcendence is coming through something that is on some level like quite mundane. Like you're not having to,
mm.
I don't know, like take some substance or whatever, or like I don't know, put yourself into like some dangerous peak experience or whatever, and like your body and your mind is able to sort of like switch into this mode. That's really interesting.
When I think about it too, so there's a slight difference in the state between road and trail. So on road, because you're not concentrating on what your feet are doing, because you don't have to think about it. You're just moving and trying to push speed. And when you do trail, you're subconsciously, but there you are paying attention to where your feet are going, so you don't twist your ankle on uneven ground or something. And the state is a bit different. And I wonder whether that's so. Those are imperfections based on or impurities of some ground experience based on at least some remnant of self focusing on the task, and whether if you just push far enough, those slight differences fall away as well. I also don't know if this is in any way related to the void because I've never approached this intellectually or through meditation. I've only ever approached it through the body.
Maybe you should spend 20 years in a cave studying long distance running.
Sword fighting and writing a book about sword fighting.
And maybe you'll achieve it.
Nice.
Yeah, it's funny to think.
No, I think if I do more races,
Yeah.
just need to push the K's out.
Yeah.
I'm a bit heavy at the moment because I've just been an animal and just been mostly
There's
doing
this
resistance training at the
there's
gym.
this big one here down in Tassie where you I think it's 60 something, and you do it over the mountain. Like it's got like some insane elevation changes. Like it's crazy. For people listening, there's a mountain next to Hobart City, and it's quite it stands out. It's quite steep.
Yeah. Running up it will be pretty.
Although I suppose Europeans would probably just think it's a
rough.
hill. Like if you're from like Switzerland or something, they're just like, that's not a mountain.
The thing is when you're running, elevation gains.
Yeah,
Because a lot of the Swiss mountains, you're starting pretty high up as well.
True. You're already like just operating at an oxygen disadvantage just from the very beginning.
Well, yeah, the oxygen disadvantage isn't anything.
That enhances enlightenment. Just oxygen.
Like us sea level cells in
Oxygen
Australia.
deprivation also enhances enlightenment experiences. Trying to do an ultra over the Swiss Alps or something. Okay, so those are the five parts of the book. Were there any other questions that you wanted to ask?
How about I'll just quote something from the Book of the Void to give people a little flavour of what it is, because this is by far the shortest section. I quote, "What is called the spirit of the void is where there is nothing. It is not included in man's knowledge. Of course the void is nothingness. By knowing things that exist, you can know that which does not exist. That is the void." So, I don't pretend to really understand the void. And like I said earlier, I expect if I said I understood it, Musashi would say, then you don't understand it. Because if you understand the void, it is not the void.
Yeah, it's hard to tell whether or not he's talking nonsense or not, if this is just like some kind of weird like Zen like trick. He's like, I'm gonna just throw this one in there just to, and then people who really go out and master it, they'll see through it and they'll be like, no, there is a thing. Who knows?
He's probably talking about something that's very profound and true in a deep sense. Whether the precise words themselves are true or merely a way to shock you into experiencing this deep truth, I don't know. I'll take him seriously because of who it is, but I don't pretend to really get this.
Yeah, maybe. So there's a couple of other questions here that we've got. Did you want to discuss any of them?
Yeah. How about the nature of excellence So we've touched on this a few times during the episode, but one of the main points of the Book of Five Rings seems to be that with capital W ways, with mastering things, with achieving excellence, if you achieve a deep enough level of excellence, it seems that all forms, all external actualizations of this central excellence, they all point towards this one excellence or this one mastery. And if you just get deep enough in mastering one thing, then there's actually this way in which it relates to every concrete manifestation of mastery. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, like is there like a master algorithm or something?
Yeah, this deep unitive knowledge of everything.
Or like another way to put it would be something like there's like an abstract class of like mastery, and then each particular field has a particular like concrete or subclass of this thing.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to think that that is in fact the case. There's something like that happening. I don't know if you'd say it's like metaphysical and like kind of out in the world somehow. I would imagine it's something to do with like the laws of epistemology. It'd be something along the lines of like the way in which like knowledge is created, which like obviously me following like getting really into Popper and Deutsch and stuff, like it's like conjecture and refutation. You're doing that like across skill sets. You realize like there's these deep unifying ways of like how you actually create knowledge and refine it and deepen it. And doing that in a single skill set is, well, you've got to learn these principles. These like what would you call it? This has like a lot of reach. It'll like go to every single skill set, but you've got to go and do at least one skill set to mastery to see the actual application of it. And then once you have embodied that in a single skill, you see like, okay, well, in order to do this again with like a new skill, I've got to like do these same, do the analogous sort of things, but with respect to that new field.
I wonder then if you could describe it more accurately as a method of learning. That if you've mastered one thing sufficiently, you understand it. I guess like learning languages, you understand in a very deep sense what is useful, and then at a higher level, in terms of just practical things to do, you also understand the practicalities of how to approach
and the discipline. Because I think there's importantly
you've learned the discipline. You're right.
There's also an ethical thing here. Like it's really interesting, isn't it, that the universe is constructed such that in order to create knowledge about it, you must commit before running the experiment to to the value of truth. You know, it's not entirely clear to me that had to be the case, that the universe could have been structured such that like you could create knowledge without valuing truth. Like and so it's interesting to me that like with this particular thing, like you actually need to like adopt a certain set of ethics in order to master something. And some of those ethics include like commitment, consistency, patience. Those are values in ethics. So even though you might say like, okay, well, we know intellectually the way that you need to learn is trial and error or criticism and refutation, and it's good to get feedback on things, and the shorter your feedback loop is, and you can sort of like get into all the like training science or whatever, how to learn skills. And that's all intellectual until you actually like, okay, well, you actually want to put this into practice in your life and you want to become really good at something, especially if you want to be a top performer in the field. And what's interesting is that there's a certain point at which the value or the ethic of like courage and what would you say, courage and being comfortable, being like alone in your perspective would probably come into play, because if you're a master at something, you've achieved levels of proficiency that nobody else has. And so you're on the edge of the art, you're on the edge of the craft or whatever it is, and the things that you're doing have never been done before. So you can't possibly have learnt them from like an existing source, like a teacher or an existing book. You must be creating that knowledge, doing that learning through just like processing your like raw experience at the edge of the art.
Maybe that's then a really foundational component of what he means when he's talking about this unity of ways of getting used to taking only your own knowledge and your experience that you've built up over extensively training upon other people's experience and building that out. Because maybe that's, if not mastery, then a key component of mastery is the ability then to integrate your own knowledge as the substrate of generating more knowledge.
Yeah. It's it would be cool to be a top performer at something, wouldn't it? Like,
yeah, not only a top performer, but a historical top performer. Like this guy, he's just the best.
You know what? Like, not only was he good at like pottery and painting and swordsmanship, but he's incredibly good at writing. Like hundreds of years later.
Yeah. But people are still reading what he wrote.
People know what he's written. He's probably like actually a better writer than he is at any of those other. Or is that somewhat parochial? Like he just happened to live at a time where like they didn't have streaming technologies where he could like live stream himself cutting people.
I guess maybe what you could say is that of all the things he mastered, writing is the one that continues today to be highly competitive. So with sword fighting, for example, it's now like if you have an automatic rifle, it doesn't matter how good the other guy is at sword fighting. You're gonna shoot him.
Yeah.
So that while it's very impressive that he was so good at it, and he lived at a time when that was a highly salient skill. Of all the things he did, mastering writing is the thing that is still today a highly salient skill.
Yeah, and what's in, I suppose, also like scalable and time resilient as well. It's like because it's
extremely
and stuff. But there's this amazing idea from the beginning of Infinity where David Deutsch talks. Sorry, it's been a while since I've like spoken about the beginning of Infinity and David Deutsch on the podcast, but I've just started like rereading the beginning of Infinity and like or like rereading just some of the chapters every now and then. I just go back and like have a read. But one of the first, I think it might be chapter 1 actually, is about reach. This idea that Deutsch calls reach, which is like an explanation can explain more. It can like be deeper. It can go out into the world, and it can have consequences and have insights beyond even what the originator of the explanation thought, and have all sorts of interesting consequences. And that's what Deutsch calls reach. And like deeper and better explanations tend to have, or I'd say like have a lot of reach. They're not parochial. I think what's so strange about like what Musashi is saying is like there must be something in here that has a lot of reach from the point of view of like, okay, a lot of people in different disciplines have found things that he's said in this book to be like worthwhile considering or integrating into the way that they act, and it's apparently helped them get the results that they want. And that's incredible, like that he's like managed to like stretch out his mind into the future for hundreds of years across millions of people's lives. And this core idea of like mastery and the way, and like the void and stuff when it comes to this sort of excellence, actually apparently it works. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I guess there's sort of a unity of what Musashi, Deutsch, Mishima were all saying about how there does seem to be some invariant thing that is described, and in it being described, we call that knowledge or a way. There are a lot of different ways to verbalize it, and at least according to Mishima, that verbalization is always going to be imperfect because it's going to be in some way personal.
Yeah. What's
in that, and I guess it's not a perfect, it's not a one-to-one, but that has a lot of similarities to what Deutsch calls parochial, how it's based on a particular set of circumstances that if you vary them, then that thing you're saying stops being true or becomes less true. And Mishima would say it's individual. And the more you de-individuate, or I guess in Deutsch's term, the less parochial it is, the more abstracted it is, the more it's approaching, probably asymptotically. Unfortunately, we might never intersect with this absolute truth, this external truth, but it's at least asymptotically approaching this noumenal truth. And the process of what Mishima called trying to de-individuate his writing to make it as close to this as possible, or Musashi talking about you approach the void as you practice to the point where you de-individuate your technique, or Deutsch saying you refine truth, you test it and refine it to the point where you deparochialize it as much as possible. All of them using imperfect, individual, to an extent in probably unavoidably parochial methods. They're all approaching whatever this void is, this truth.
And so two things on top of that. One, the other person that you could mix in there would be like Jung with writing, like psychological versus visionary writing, potentially. Has this same sort of structure. As in psychological writing being, is that the term we use? Psychological, being more parochial or personal. And
psychological, talking about one's own experiences approaching
and visionary
something.
Writing, being able to like reach out and describe or correspond to something like in the broader culture beyond the person's individual experience. But then also another interesting idea is like, how would I say this? Like, there's our mind is a menagerie of ideas, some of which are explicit and we can articulate and transmit in the form of things like language, but many of which are actually inexplicit, and some of which are conscious and some of which are unconscious, and they're all interacting with one another. And in some way, it seems as though like this mastery stuff that these people are talking about is enabling, I suppose, the explicit ideas to be, if not turned off, deprioritized within like the landscape of theories that are competing for like conscious attention within the mind of the person. And it allows like the training and the presence and all that sort of stuff allows the inexplicit ideas and the unconscious ideas to interact and to have an effect, and not be down-regulated or interfered with by the sub-process that is responsible for like communication and what's the word that you use, like commentary and that sort of stuff. It's really interesting. I guess there's a lot to understand.
Maybe to build on that.
Yeah.
There's so much. To build on that, then maybe at least in part, the void is the understanding that the human mind is instantiated within whatever this noumenal truth is. And it itself is trying to work out what it fundamentally is, what is instantiated as. And maybe that's also part of this mastery, is the intuitive understanding of the mind as actually being fundamentally whatever this external truth is.
Yeah, or like,
I'm not sure if I phrase that. It's hard to phrase that.
Different way of like putting it is like you are like touch the source or whatever, or like maybe another way of putting it would be like your mind your experience participates in like much more universal abstraction.
Yeah, I guess your mind is a parochialism, or it's a pocket within sort of an absolute unity.
Yeah.
And so this process of de-individuating or deparochializing is slowly understanding the mind's place as a parochial pocket or a small area within a broader
Yeah, that's
reality.
so interesting because like I think that is in fact the case to some degree. And I might be wrong on this because obviously like this is just like Levi's thoughts. But there's and I'm just gonna throw this out. You like let me know what you think. I don't know if this has any truth in it, but like in computation, and I'll try my best to like explain this, even though it's about computer stuff, like in a way that hopefully you can understand. I'll try
to understand.
Like, so you can get like a good example would be like we've just upgraded from like the Intel chips on Macs to these new M1, M2, M3 chips. They actually have like a different architecture, and there's actually lots of different architectures. There's like the von Neumann architecture, the Harvard architecture of like how you actually do computation. But what you'll notice is that all of these computer chips, and even if you go back like 150 years, if you've ever seen pictures of those giant warehouse-sized computers, they're using like vacuum tubes or whatever. So they're using different physical devices which have different like physical structures and different materials and stuff. And computation is this thing that is so abstract, it cuts across all those different forms that it takes. And so you can think of like computation, there's only like, there might be different ways in which it's instantiated, such as like this architecture or that architecture. Or like, obviously one of the architectures must be a neural thing, like what's going on in the brain. But there might be different ways in which you can perform computation, but there's only one computation. It's just like the Turing machine and the random access machine and like the lambda calculus. Another, like, these are all different ways of expressing this other thing that they're trying to reference, which is computation. And that computation is, we've found different mathematical ways to express it, and we've found different ways that we can configure physical systems to represent those mathematical abstractions. But they're actually participating in a higher level abstraction, which we can only ever point to. And if I sort of think about like personhood in the same way, I would express basically an analogous thing where you like have this idea of computation or universal computation, and then you have different forms in which it can be expressed and instantiated. I think there's like personhood. There's just like universal there must be an algorithm that hopefully we'll one day have that's like, this is how you create a person, and that expression will point to something more abstract. And every time it gets instantiated in a different body, whether it's like a silicon chip or whether it's like a human mind or whether it's like a different alien species, if there's other species that have evolved intelligence, they'll all participate in this like one thing, which is personhood. And it's unified by like this creativity, this capacity to transform the universe around them and to understand the world. And I think like a lot of these experiences that these people like Musashi or the Zen Buddhists and stuff, like what they're kind of seeing is they're seeing that higher level abstraction. They're just turning off the fact that they are this particular body, and they realize, oh, actually there's this unification of all people are having experiences, and you can just think of like, maybe you have a glimpse of just experience as such.
What about, so this might be an imperfect metaphor. Let me know how well this reflects what you're saying. So if you think about, okay, so a 2D object if you take a slice of it, that slice is going to be a 1D object. There's going to be a line if you just cut it down the middle. And if you take a 3D object like a sphere and take a slice of it, that slice is going to be a 2D object. It'll be a circle. And like with a 4D object, you take a slice of it, and that slice is going to be a 3D object. And these slices aren't wrong or untrue. They're a reflection of that object above them in dimensionality that they're a slice of, but they're incomplete. And then in some way, you could also say that, say you were listing different ways to compute. They're all parochial slices of some deeper or higher dimensional knowledge or computation, this abstract entity of what is computation. And it's not that they're untrue, but they're incomplete and parochial. And the same goes for mastery in trying to master any abstract discipline. The aim is getting less parochial towards whatever this all-encompassing entity is that you're aiming your mastery towards.
Yeah, it becomes borderline platonic, doesn't it? It's almost like there's this...
yeah, it becomes very platonic. It's almost as if the guy was onto something.
What would you say, like the form? There's like there's the Turing machine, and it's a shadow of the ideal form of computation. It's just one expression. And then people, there's like, hopefully one day we find other people that are not instantiated in Homo sapien bodies, but are instantiated in other substrates. And but they're all they're mere shadows of like the unified creative entity. That's what I guess I'd replace the word like person. Like there's maybe what I'd call is like that entity in the universe which is creative and capable of transforming the universe. And
yeah, were we to find a non-human person in the universe, that would be a further abstraction. We would be deparochialized.
I would hope so.
Okay, these things happen.
I think what it will require to do that for like, say we start interacting with like aliens or whatever, for that to go well, like I think like the planet needs like a lot more better ideas about what it means to like be a person. And yeah, so that, you know, like when we actually do if we were to actually interact with other aliens that are creative and capable of building technology to like, you know, travel, I don't know, like interplanetary travel or whatever, like hopefully we don't freak out and stuff about it. But anyways, back to mastery. Like yeah, it's interesting. I think I would imagine that is it called monism? Yeah, I think I would probably be inclined towards what Musashi is talking about, like this monism of mastery.
Yeah, but also in a practical sense, I think it's definitely worth looking at people who have mastered things and then trying to draw commonalities and taking very seriously what they've said. And quite often with people who've achieved a profound level of mastery in something, like Musashi, where he got to the age of 30, he had defeated 60 people in duels and said, you know what, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to study what I got right and wrong in those duels for 20 years straight. People who achieve that level of mastery do tend to say fairly similar things. They seem to be circling the same object, that there is a unity of knowledge if you just go deep enough.
I hope so. That sounds really cool. It's very...
Yeah.
To me, that's the sort of... That idea, if it's true, which it seems like there's good reason to think that there must be some truth in it. To me, that's like a really... compelling and meaningful like thing to think about, and you know
I find it deeply meaningful
and to potentially
almost
integrate it into one's life. Like I can see why attaining mastery actually might be like a in whatever field a path towards like I know, living a rich and fulfilling and meaningful life. Actually, that's like quite interesting. That's why it's good that you've like gone and like committed yourself to this writing stuff. I think it's great. You can obviously get mastery across different things, but like the fact that you're like how are you going with that? Do you have any thoughts in your writing with regards to this topic?
No, I'm so far from mastery. So far from it.
Yeah.
If such a thing is possible of achieving mastery in writing, which I just don't know if it is, then yeah, look, maybe ask me in 30 years.
My only criticism of Musashi on what
going.
I'd like to take into account with what you've just said, maybe there isn't any such thing as mastery. Maybe there's no zenith. Maybe it's a beginning of infinity. Maybe we don't know how beautiful a text could be. Like when people first started writing however long ago, could they have imagined how beautiful, Shakespeare's sonnets are? Probably not. And we don't know how much more beautiful writing could get. And maybe we don't know how much more sophisticated and nuanced like a swordsman could be than Musashi. And maybe my only criticism would be like this idea of mastery kind of makes it sound like it's like you get to this stage and then you're at the top and then like maybe that's it. It's like a closed system. Whereas I prefer a conception of mastery that's actually that it's open. There's no absolute top, and even if you push yourself to your limits and you become the best in the world in your field at that particular time and you leave your legacy in history, that somebody else could always come along and still take the discipline further.
It's interesting that you saw it that way, because maybe it's because, and this is contingent upon how accurately the English word way is a rendition of whatever he's talking about in Japanese, but I felt because of the use of the term way, it was a continuous process, that mastery it's a function, not an output. Because way does imply it's movement.
Yeah.
That you pursue a way and you just continue
rendering
moving.
into English.
But I'm also not sure, because both the apparent problems of translating this work into English or any other language forces you to take a position on things that are left, if not unsaid, then intentionally vague in the original. And also my lack of familiarity with, say, Zen Buddhism, where they regard mastery as this continuous process.
I would assume they do, and I would assume that Musashi does as well. I guess just being picky, just nitpicking. That like if you were to read this and you had that interpretation, that I would err on the side of the open-ended conception of the way or mastery, or like it's this never-ending thing. Because the Zen Buddhists have this idea of beginner's mind, which is that like even the greatest meditation or master or whatever, in each next moment they're still a beginner. It's like beginner's mind. And I think like always be learning. This mastery, like the path of mastery is a path of always being able to be a beginner in the next moment.
Yeah. I probably don't have much more to say about this. I got to go as well. But final thoughts. This book's well worth reading. It's really good. It's only on the surface a book about fighting people with swords, and that surface is very cool. And this guy was really good at fighting people with swords, which makes me more positively inclined towards it. But there's a whole lot more beneath that surface. It's really good. I'll definitely read this again.
Yeah, and the samurai in Tekken is like really fun to play. So like I'm inclined towards like Musashi being like.
This entire book is actually about Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice.
So I don't have anything else to say. I think my apologies if I sound tired. I am. It's a little bit later in the afternoon for like me in my time zone. Jack's just like getting going, man.
We'll do. I'll do a few evening shifts. So you can do some morning shifts.
But I hope that I don't know. That's interesting. That conversation felt very similar to the Jung conversation. Hey, like just talking about that sort of thing.
Yeah, and also to a number of conversations we have outside of the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to talk about these things, isn't it? It's really interesting.
Shout out to Hyrotaf. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're still listening. Shout out to Cryo. Shout out to Fake Gamer Boy. I'm just picking people at random as well. I probably should think about who to give shout outs to.
Yeah, shout out to our patrons as well who have been joining us on our now bi-weekly. Well,
Our weekly chats.
Try to make it weekly. I don't know. We'll see how we go. Yeah, our chats. And is there anything else? I think that's it. I think that's all for us. Yeah, thanks for listening. I hope that was enjoyable. I hope that wasn't too tangential.
That was a really good book.
Yeah, do read it.
All right.
See ya.
See you next time.